one of the movements that I really embrace right now is not to dethrone Western science, but is to create a convergence of ways of thinking, addressing the same question. So for example, if you talk about the nature of intelligence, right? What is intelligence? Well, what kind of intelligence? Because you have all these different kinds of intelligences. Plant intelligence. Plants have developed strategies for survival for millions and millions of years. They have a lot to teach us because they work together, right? And collective intelligence of insects. Bees are spectacular, right? They have the idea of the beehive, right? I mean, this kind of like is we work together for the good of the whole hive. And there is this thing called collective intelligence. And so let's think of the human hive a little bit and how we are all working together or could work together to create the common good at a global scale.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Lindley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label to distinguish organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock raised on well-managed pasture, all without synthetic fertilizers and toxic chemicals. You just heard from Brazilian physicist and astronomer Marcelo Gleiser, a professor at Dartmouth College and a friend and neighbor of Dave Chapman. Marcelo's work touches upon how humans fit into deep time, as well as the complexities of nature, both of which are themes that agriculture is deeply wrestling with. His message that there is only one Earth reminds us of how unique our existence in this universe is, and how important it is to focus on preserving life on our home planet.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm talking with Marcelo Gleiser today. Marcelo is an old friend, and he's a physicist who has spent most of his teaching career at Dartmouth College. He's written many books. He's gotten many honors and awards. I went down to New York to see him receive the Templeton, which was just so much fun, Marcelo. They had the whole Dartmouth Symphony playing. Yeah, that was great. So we're here today. I asked Marcelo to wedge me into his busy schedule, and I wanted to talk first about the book, The Dawn of a Mindful Universe, a Manifesto for Humanity's Future. Okay. And that's a big title, a manifesto. Mm-hmm. So would you just describe the book to me a bit, obviously, in layman's terms?
Sure. So, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be part of your conversation. I think it's wonderful that you can listen to what I have to say, because honestly, I think it's going to align very well with your whole purpose, of this movement, which I find it profoundly necessary right now. So that's just an opening statement about how excited I am to be here. So this book is really a departure from my other books that were more, let's say, always related to science as a narrative that we humans construct to understand who we are in terms of members of a cosmic history, right? And so how do we do this? So I am a cosmologist, which is a fancy word that basically means a person that spends her time trying to figure out the history of the universe from the Big Bang to nowadays. So it's a big task, right? So how the universe came to be what it is, filled with galaxies and stars and planets, and in one planet at least, life in incredible, abundant diversity. This question of how come this planet of ours hosts life, and is this planet the rule or the exception? Meaning, are there gazillions of other planets out there that also host life? Or are we really a rare oasis in the universe? Is the core of my book. And essentially, the argument that I construct in the book, and what I do is a mix of, there are two lines of thinking in the book. One is a brief history of civilization as we know it. So starting all the way from the hunter-gatherers, pre-agrarian civilization, what kind of organization they had in their lives, right? And there's a huge amount of new anthropological studies that talk about the vision that we had before of the brute caveman, always fighting with one another is incorrect, that there was a lot of interbreeding, there was a lot of cooperation between different groups. And in fact, they also collaborated and sometimes merged together, these groups of hunter-gatherers. And so I start the story there, and I can elaborate in a second, and move on to the huge transition in worldview that happened between those groups and the beginnings of agrarian civilization, and the shift in religious beliefs that also accompanied this transition, from the hunter-gatherer societies, a lot of them still very much mirrored in many of the a lot of them mirrored in many of the native cultures that we have across the world, the relationship of the world being a sacred relationship, to the transition to agrarian societies where the gods become more abstract, they go to the heavens, they leave the earth into the hands of people, and there is a sense of ownership that accompanies this transition that has basically framed our conversation with the natural world for about 10,000 years, meaning we believe that we own pieces of the planet. I always think, who was the first guy, right, that said, you know what, folks, this piece of land is mine. This piece of the planet is mine. And because of that, I am going to either not allow you to come into my piece of land, my piece of the world. And if you want anything that I produce here, you either have to give me something in return, or I won't give it back to you. And if you invade, I'm going to fight back. This kind of transition from the planet is our sacred mother, there is an animistic relationship, a spiritual relationship with everything that exists in the world. The waters have their spirits, the forests have their spirits, the mountains, the waterfalls, the clouds, the rain. There was no separation between the natural and the supernatural. There was no supernatural because everything was natural, was part of their existence. And there was a translator to this story, which was the shaman, and still is, who basically could perceive, sense the wills of the gods, of these spirits, and translate that to the rest of the tribe. In a sense, scientists, philosophers, religious leaders are doing something very similar. They are trying to sense the mysteries that surround us about the natural world, about the spiritual world, and translate that in ways that all of us can understand. So the beginning of the book is really a history of how we got here. Because once there was the transition from the agrarian society and people started to produce more food in smaller amounts in smaller regions and domesticating animals, then you have essentially this sense of control of the natural world. So we become the masters of the land, right? And with that kind of narrative allied to the development of technologies, this all grew. And then, of course, jumping to the 16th, 17th centuries, you have the revolution in the sciences. You have a huge growth in the understanding of the mechanisms of the natural world. And that initial description, that the planets go in orbits that satisfy mathematical laws, that there is a law of nature or laws of nature, so there is order in nature, and that we can understand this stuff. Then not just the practicality of controlling the land, but the understanding of the natural world kind of inflated our perception of being controlling of what's going on.
So just to kind of create some context, about how long was the period, we believe, where we were hunters-gatherers until we hit agriculture?
Good, that's a great question. So we are thinking that we meaning Homo sapiens, our species has been around for about 300,000 years. And so it's about 95% of our existence as a species, we've been hunter-gatherers. So this whole transition into cities, city-states, and a more hierarchical control of power happened only about 10,000, 12,000 years ago. You know, the Sumerians and then the Babylonians, the Egyptians, etc.
These always happened in areas where there was enough natural fertility or annual flooding to bring in, to replenish the soil. So those were always the cradles of civilization.
Yeah, the Fertile Crescents, right?
Fertile Crescent, which we've managed to turn into the desert.
The Tigris in the Euphrates, yeah. Right? And nowadays Iraq, and then the Nile in Egypt. I mean, and you see this not just even in the Middle East. You see that every big center, metropolitan center, has a river around it, or across it. You know, London, Paris, you know, New York. I mean, and the reason for that is that you need this flow of water because that's where the food is coming from, essentially. Not just because you're planting close to it, but because you can transport. Right. So those rivers serve this dual purpose.
So there was several huge shifts in human understanding on a societal level. One was when we started to grow food and stay in the same area. And another would be the Renaissance, where we started to have this very different understanding of the world as interpreted by people who were committed to studying that, the scientists.
Right. And what happened there is that this mechanistic way of thinking about the world took hold. Right? So everything was a mechanism. Even if you read the Declaration of Independence of the United States, you read in the text the laws of man and the laws of nature. You know, you talk about forces that determine things. I mean, this is Newton. This is physics, you know, interfering or inspiring perhaps, you know, the way societies are organized, not just the natural world. So this story gave rise to, jumping forward a little bit, you know, the incredible success of this way of thinking about the world, to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, right? Where people really started to use fossil fuels and the pool whales to basically fuel a civilization as we know it, right? And I always say that the world that we have built in the last 150 years was fed from the entrails of our planet. Because all of the fuels that we use, right? I mean, the fossil fuels at least, you know, the natural gas, the oil, the natural coal, all of this stuff comes from the remain of life that existed here millions and millions of years ago, that was processed into these fuels. And so in a sense, the chemistry of these fuels is the remains of life that existed here a long time ago. And a lot of it is from plants. And so when you take a piece of natural coal, of mineral coal, right? In that chemistry of that natural coal, you have in it the light of the sun that made that plant exist through photosynthesis millions of years ago, right? And when you burn that coal again, it's sort of like liberating that light that is an ancient light, but with it, you're also liberating all the bad stuff that obviously is polluting the atmosphere. So we are basically feeding our urban industrial growth based on this buried dead life, right, that has been transformed.
So just, I'm still stunned when you start looking at big time.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you rather than tell you, how many years were the dinosaurs on the planet?
Oh, sure. So yeah, I love all these numbers. So the dinosaurs, they were in the planet for 150 million years.
Staggering.
And the only reason they disappeared is because 65 million years ago, this big asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And it was like a 8-mile wide piece of rock. And you say, how could an 8-mile wide, like the size of Manhattan, say, how could something that small completely change the planet? Well, because in physics, there's this thing called kinetic energy, which is the energy of motion, which is mass times the velocity squared, okay? And that rock had a lot of mass, but the velocity of that thing was about 20,000 miles an hour. So you think of a rock which is 8 miles wide, traveling at 20,000 miles an hour, hitting the land, the amount of energy that the impact deposited is somewhat equivalent to this, just to give you some kind of like mind-blowing number. If you detonated all hydrogen bombs at the climax of the Cold War, it's about 5,000 of them, not atomic bombs, not the Oppenheimer stuff, the thermonuclear bombs, just 1,000 times stronger than that. So you detonate those 5,000 bombs at the same time, and you multiply the energy liberated by 100,000 times. That's roughly the energy this impact caused. And because of that, there was so much stuff that happened to the planet. For example, you know when you throw a little rock on a pond and a little water, you have this reflux, right, that goes up? Well, the matter that rebounded from this went all the way to halfway to the moon. Just think about that. And then it came down again, and it covered the whole planet in this dark, thick layer of dust that covered the sun for many, many decades. And the dinosaurs, cold blood. And who survived? The little mammals, the rodents that were around, scurrying around. And to me, and this is essential to the narrative of this book and to the fundamental moral principles that I bring at the end of it, is that if this impact had not happened, we wouldn't be here. So the point being that the history of life on the planet is completely contingent on a series of accidents. And you change any one of them, life would have taken a different turn because, life responds through evolution to environmental pressure. It's called selective pressure. And this thing changed because it killed the dinosaurs, it killed about 70% of the life on Earth. And it's sort of like pushing the reset button on evolution and say, what kind of life can emerge now? And we are here because of this, right? So this is, to me, absolutely fantastic because the plants also survived. And by the way, the plants have been around for 300 million years, way before the dinosaurs. And they are still here, which to me shows that they have developed survival strategies which are incredibly smart. And there are lots of very interesting people now, very good scientists and others coming from spiritual dimensions as well. They are studying the spiritual and intelligence of those plants, the spiritual and natural intelligence of those plants. And this kind of profound relationship between us and the plants as expressed in all these different, native cultures has been essential for us to create our own narrative of who we are.
Yeah, I remember the ICE dialogue that you hosted at Dartmouth with Richard Powers and Monica Gagliano.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, they're both wonderful people.
Yeah, wonderful. And just talking about the intelligence of plants.
Yeah.
And, what this means and the miracle of it. We walk around so unaware of everything that is living around us and that supports us, without which we don't live.
Yeah. It's sort of like this. The way we have evolved over the last 10,000 years is to think of plants and the natural world as a commodity. And that is true for farmers too. But they are not a commodity. Those plants, the natural, they are partners. And that calls for a completely different kind of mindset of relationship with, because without them, we wouldn't be here. it's a very simple equation, right? I mean, if you don't breathe good air, if you don't drink good water, if you don't have protection from the radiation that comes from the sky, you're done. We're done. Our project of civilization is finished, right? And the reason why I wrote this book is I felt that we, as a species, we reached a civilizational bottleneck right now, where this is the time to make a big difference. And if we don't, then those dystopian scenarios that I profoundly dislike, my book is actually an optimistic approach to the problem that we now face, because it's very easy to paint a horrible picture of what's going to happen to the world. That's what a lot of public intellectuals are doing, right? So, oh yes, it's not just pollution and global warming, but it's also AI and a bunch of other, and thermonuclear war, which is always present, and we're doomed. And I'm like, it's so easy, to sound the alarm. Anyone can sound the alarm. But the question is, how do you change this narrative? And that's what I'm trying, in my small way to contribute with this book. So the way I construct my narrative is say, this is how we got here. We got here because our development through science and industrialization forced us, unknowingly perhaps, to forget our roots to nature, our roots to the natural world. So we have to retell the story of who we are, reframing our connection to the natural world. And so what I do is I go through this whole astronomical analysis, right? So that's where my scientist hat is on, where I explain, given what we know nowadays, not just of planets in our solar system, but let me just go here for a second, okay? Because it's good. So let's talk about our solar system, our little cosmic neighborhood, right? Because it's essential. Know thy universe is very, very important for us. So our neighbors, Mars and Venus. Mars is a frozen desert. It's a horrible place, right? People think that in the first billion years of its existence, so again, to give context, the solar system, the sun, and the planets, they all emerged together from a condensing cloud of gas. And that happened about 4.5 billion years ago. Okay, so that's how old we're all together in this. Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the sun, we all were born together about 4.5, let's make it 5 billion just to talk about round numbers. And the amazing thing about this is that, and there are a few amazing things, but one of them is that any one of the worlds here, from Mercury to Venus, to Earth, to Mars, to Jupiter, to Saturn, to Uranus, to Neptune, poor Pluto, who is now demoted, but is still around. All of these worlds are completely different from one another. And there is no two worlds even close to being similar. You say, Venus and Mars have about similar masses and sizes to Earth. No, maybe, but with that, they're still completely different worlds. Venus is a total hell. Like Venus is so hot that the rocks glow, and it has sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. And it has this other compound, which is the same one that derives from rotten eggs. So it stinks of sulfur. It rains sulfuric acid. It's incredibly hot. So that's exactly what hell is like, right? I mean, the medieval. And so Mercury is a rock, dead, completely dead, that only faces the sun. It doesn't turn. And then the other planets, Jupiter and company, they're gas planets. You can't even stand on their surfaces because they don't have a surface. They're just a big gas ball. Only the very core of them is frozen and solid because of the pressure. So the point being that each world, and this is really, really amazing, each world has its own story to tell, right? Has a very different evolution. And the fact that Earth is the way it is, that it's at the distance from the sun, where it's not too hot or not too cold, in the sense that it can have water at its surface that is liquid, that it has enough mass to hold an atmosphere together, is what allows for life to be here in the first place, right? And so this is our neighbor. And then I forgot to mention, don't forget the moons, right? Because we have moons too. Our moon is a dead rock, but Jupiter and Saturn has, well, Jupiter alone has more than 70 moons. Saturn too. Each one of them is different. And they're all fascinating worlds. I mean, there is a moon of Jupiter called Io that has volcanoes exploding, like the Little Prince, you know, like that kind of stuff. And subsurface oceans, right? And so it has an incredible diversity of worlds. We actually nowadays, instead of talking about comparative literature, in astronomy, people are talking about comparative planetology, looking at different worlds, studying how they all are. And so what I do in the book is I go through this whole analysis, and then I step out of our solar system and go to other planets going around other stars which are not the sun, and just give people a sort of like an idea here, grounding. We're all part of a galaxy, the Milky Way. The Milky Way has about, nobody counted, but that's an estimate, 200 billion stars, right? So that's a 2 with 11 zeros after it. That's stars. Stars, like the sun. And each one of these stars, or most of them, now we know, we didn't know this for sure 30 years ago, but now we do know, each one of them has planets. And those planets, a lot of them will have moons. So you do the math and say, damn, 200 billion stars, an average of 5 planets per star, you're talking about 1 trillion worlds. 1 trillion is a 1 with 12 zeros. And each one of these worlds, and this is the point that I really hammer down in the book, is different. Because people say, even scientists, my book is a criticism to the status quo, or to the ways astronomers and astrobiologists who study life in the universe think about this. They say, hey, so many worlds, there has to be something similar to our planet out there, meaning the same chemistry, going around a similar star as the sun. So of these 200 billion stars, only 7% of them are like our sun. Which, it's a lot to talk about 35 billion out of, But when you start to say, okay, but if you want a planet that is kind of like the sun, not too close, not too far, so water is liquid, and these other properties that our planet has, like has a big moon, having one single big moon is what stabilizes the planet. Our planet is tilted by 23.5 degrees, and it rotates like a spinning top like this that is about to fall, but it's not falling. That's called the precession of the equinoxes. And by the way, we're taping this on summer solstice day, so wonderful, right? And the only reason this happens is because the gravity of the moon stabilizes this tilt. It doesn't let it randomly fluctuate like this. If this were not true, there'll be no seasons. And if no seasons, the weather, the climate on the planet would be completely random, and life would not be possible, right? Because life is sturdy, resilient, but it does exist within certain limits of cold and heat, right? I mean, there is a window of possibility for life. So you put that together, you put the fact that we have an atmosphere that is thick enough to protect us from radiation, that we have a magnetic field created by the core of the Earth, which is made of nickel and iron, spinning hot stuff, creates a magnetic field that is basically literally a shield against all this very bad stuff that comes from outer space, like protons and other kinds of radiation that comes through, that shields us from those things and protects the surface of the Earth. So the problem with Mars, for example, is that the atmosphere is so thin that all this stuff comes through and life on the surface is essentially impossible. You put all this together and you start to look at the spectacularly mysterious steps for, first of all, for chemistry to organize itself into biochemistry, meaning you need, to have a molecule of an amino acid, which is the basic stuff they need to make proteins, like the stuff of life. You need carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. Where is all this stuff coming from? Well, this stuff comes from stars that exploded before the sun was born, right? So I'll say something that I'm sure many of you guys already know, but we are truly made of dead star stuff. So stars explode, they spread out their entrails across interstellar space. These gases are traveling at incredibly fast speeds. They hit a nascent star system, a baby stellar system, sprinkle the gas cloud with carbon, the calcium that is in your bones, the iron that is in your hemoglobin, in your blood. And this stuff organizes itself into a planet eventually. And depending on the chemical composition of the planet, life can emerge. Emerged here 3.5 billion years ago. So somehow we are animated, and I love the word animated, right? Because anima in Latin is soul. So we are animated star stuff, right? And why is that beautiful? That's beautiful because it's profoundly mysterious, but also because it connects us to the deep time history of the universe itself. We carry in our bodies billions and billions of cosmic history in our atoms. So when we go, our atoms will become part of something else. Rocks, other animals, we are part of rocks and animals that existed here before because we are eating this stuff. Our ancestors ate this stuff. So we are recycled stardust, right?
Can I ask a question? So, and there's a miracle that happened here, which is that this stardust became animate, became alive. Could you, I don't know if this is simple or impossible, but how would you define life?
Yeah, so in the book, I go into this into tremendous detail, right? Because as part of my argument, what I do is so I was actually saying this and I diverged. So let me go back to that because so the criticism with the astronomical way of thinking about, there are so many planets, there'll be a ton of planets with life. The problem with that is that they're using what we call inductive thinking. They're saying, if it happened here, and if we are not special, why won't it happen many, many other places? And my argument is that it happened here because we are special. That is the switch. And why are we special? Because of the properties the planet has, and because of, I wouldn't call it a miracle, but I call it the profoundly rare and not understood steps for life to become what it became here, right? So you say defining life, nobody knows how to define life. Okay, there are what we call operational definitions of what life is. They're good to a certain point, but none of them is good enough. So, for example, if you ask NASA what is life, they'll say life is a self-organized network of chemical reactions that is capable of metabolizing energy and reproducing according to Darwinian evolution. So, translating, life is chemistry that can get energy from the environment and duplicate itself. And that's not what life is. That's what life does. And there is a profound difference between the two things, right? Because if you start to really think about this, right? So all these steps, you go from inorganic chemistry, and then you go to organic chemistry, and then you go into biochemistry, which is the amino acids, they become proteins, and somehow some of these small networks of chemicals got, absorbed in a little drop of fat, of lipid, and that became a protocell, a baby cell of some kind, and somehow energy was absorbed by that thing, and it decided that it could split into others. And so we have no clue how that happens. And then, this is the beautiful part, then life becomes intentional. Like every living creature, from the simplest amoeba to a whale, has intentionality, right? It has a purpose. I want to stay alive. Every animal wants to stay alive. And so to the point that if you get a bunch of bacteria in a petri dish, and you put a little bit of sugar, right? The bacteria will sense the presence of nutrients in that petri dish. So that means it understands its environment, it can sense it, it will orient itself towards that place, and it will transform intentionality into motion to move there, to eat that stuff. How does chemistry do that? Right? This kind of like, what is going on here? And the answer is we have no clue. So we are really good, genetics, biochemistry, we're really good at describing what life does. But how dead chemistry became living chemistry with a sense of purpose, of intentionality, of agency, of autonomy, it's unknown. So I go through all this stuff because then I go back to our planet saying, and here we are, people, this is the place where all of this is happening. And furthermore, not just this is the place where everything is happening and there are no aliens, folks, sorry. So I go and explain why there are no aliens, right? And so that means that if life exists elsewhere, it will probably be very rare. There's no reason why it couldn't. We cannot rule it out. Right? Science is very good about finding things that exist, not ruling out the things that do not exist. So I don't know if there is aliens or not out there, if there is, extraterrestrial intelligence, but what we do know is that they haven't gotten here. And we have no evidence of any kind of living things out there, right? And we're looking, that's what I do for my research. I'm looking at the composition of the atmospheres of faraway worlds to see if I find what we call biosignatures.
Yes. David Grinspoon talked about that in another one of your ice gatherings, which was so interesting and inspiring to me. The thing I remember him saying is that we started out looking for a biosignature of energy use, and now we've come to realize that probably an advanced civilization will have a tiny energy footprint because they either figured out how to go over the hump we're trying to go over, or they went extinct.
Yeah, right. So this is the so-called Fermi paradox, right? The idea that if the universe is filled with life, we've been around, our galaxy is about 10 billion years old. We are only 5 billion years old, we meaning the solar system, Earth, etc. And which means that if another star has life, and it's appeared a few million years before we did, which is nothing, in 5 billion years, a few million is nothing. If they develop technology like we have, look at us, 400 years ago was Galileo. Look where we are now, right? So if they develop technology, they would have had plenty of time to colonize or at least explore the whole of the galaxy. And so Fermi sketched this calculation, said the galaxy is this big, if you're traveling at 1/10 of the speed of light, which is not that impossible, you would see where, and so he says, where is everybody? Where are these guys, right? And so the different explanations are, there are several. There's actually a really fun book to read, which is called Where is Everybody? And there are 50 different answers to that. And one very Cold War based is that any civilization that reaches nuclear technology self-destructs in a few centuries. And so are we going to do that or not? Others are, they just suffocate themselves through the inordinate use of fuels to promote their, and the other one is that they figure things out, right? They figure things out, meaning they found a way of coexisting with the planet in such a way that their civilization is sustainable and it promotes biodiversity as opposed to destroying it. And this is the way we need to go. So when Dave and other people are talking about this kind of like future for us, it's like, what are we going to do, guys? Are we going to blow ourselves up or choke ourselves down? Or are we going to find a way to actually coexist with the planet that allows life to be possible, right? And all these other dreams, I talk about this too, all these other dreams of, oh, but we can go and colonize another planet, right? We terraform Mars. That's bullshit. That is total, I mean, not just because technologically it's completely, it's a project of thousands of years ahead in the future, right? And also because it would be a horrible life. We evolved to be in this planet. Our body mass, our muscular structure, our bones, our relationship to the environment. We are the planet Earth. We are this. We are here because we've been groomed by evolution to be here. So you go to Mars, the gravity is much lower, there is no atmosphere. It's horrible, dry, cold. Is that the future? No, the future is here now. And so over the last few years, I developed this almost aversion of thinking about colonizing or moving out into other worlds because we have so many fundamental problems to deal with here in the next few decades that is dangerous. And it's a dangerous misuse of resources to actually not be focusing everything that we've got into the next few decades here, right? So the book tries to build this argument.
Yes. And then you get to the tremendous challenge.
Yeah.
Which is, how do we change us?
Mm-hmm. How do we change us, right? Because we're so self-serving, right? So individualistic in our needs and...
I mean, we aren't even self-serving. If we were, we would change, but we're suicidal.
Ah, good. Okay, even better. Because we are ignorant of what's going on, right? And so what we need to do, and so the end of the book, it's called A Manifesto for Humanity's Future, and I had to reread the Communist Manifesto in order to say, okay, how do you write a manifesto, right? Because it's not something that you do every day. A manifesto has essentially two parts. The first part is you build the argument to explain why change is absolutely necessary right now. So you developed the argumentation to show that if things remain the way they are, the system will break down, right? And then you go, okay, and what do you need to do in order to change the narrative, right? I mean, what are we going to do to... So in the case of Marx and Engels, it was, workers of the world unite, right? Because the bourgeoisie is stifling and destroying you, and we need to change the political system and the economical system, etc. So my revolution is much more benign. In fact, it doesn't call for any bloodshed in principle. In fact, it tries to avoid it. And it makes each one of us imbued with a sense of purpose. So the idea is that I break it down into small actions that any one of us needs to do. So when we talk about what can we do, right? I mean, I've given enough talks about this and talked to enough people about this that you have this sense that most people feel powerless. That who am I to do anything? I'm just a person, What I do is irrelevant in the big scheme of things. And it's really the government and the big corporations that have to do something about this. Well, that is an invitation to disaster and collapse. Because unless we understand that each one of us, we have a role to play in this changing of mindset, then we are never going to succeed. And humanity, if you look at the history of humanity, people tend to unite against a common enemy, right? That's being the thing. And the problem with our situation is that the enemy is ourselves as a whole. The global enemy of our survival is the human species, right? And one of the reasons for that is that we have split ourselves into many different tribes. And we forgot that we all belong to the same tribe, which is the human tribe, right? I mean, first and foremost, we are a species of apes in a planet that needs to survive in this planet in order to move forward, right? And surviving in the planet does not mean killing the planet for us, like, Easter Island or something like that, but it's actually developing policies and educational efforts that will reorient the way we actually relate to the world. So what do I propose? And people say, oh, these proposals are naive, they're impossible to implement. And my answer to that is, naive is doing nothing. Innocent is doing nothing. If you believe that not changing the way you eat or the way you use energy is not going to change things, that this is not your job, then we're doomed. So that's what's innocent, is to actually push the blame and the work to other structures, So my idea, right, is that every citizen should be empowered to start to change. How? So I talk about different principles. Principle number one is the principle of the less. Less what? Less meat, less water, less energy, less garbage. So these 4 lesses, right? And I'm not saying that it's realistic to think that the whole population of the world is going to become vegan overnight, but I think that if people would cut down their consumption of meat by, say, 50%, it would already have an impact, right? Because to me, as an individual, the most important thing you can do, and you guys probably know this better than I do, is to eat less meat. That's one fundamental thing, for the many reasons that you guys know better than I do. So that's the less. Water consumption, water protection, energy consumption, and what kinds of energy, and where is your energy coming from? So that's number one. Number two is, so that was the last. Number two is the more, the principle of the more. More what? More exposure to the natural world. Because what has happened, and I jumped over this whole thing in our conversation, is that with the development of agrarian societies and the development of city-states and bigger cities up to now, the modern megalopolis, what we have done in order to grow is we push nature out. Cities are the anti-nature. They are big blocks of concrete and steel and glass and cars and pavement. And you have the little parks there, which are kind of almost like sad to look at, right? And because they're nature enslaved to our very, very kind of blind needs. And so people don't even know nature anymore. You go to the big cities, right? I mean, people don't even know what it means to walk in a forest, to look at green, to look at the sky. They don't see any of that. Oh, they see maybe a tree here or there, or a little bird, but that is not nature. And exposure to nature is essential in this story, because we need to understand where we came from, where we are, what do we belong to, right? This severance that we have developed over 10,000 years from being completely immersed in nature to being completely outside of nature is what allowed for us to feel ourselves above nature and hence do with it what we want, transform nature into a commodity and not into an entity that is our partner in our story of survival, right? And so more exposure, and how do you do that? Well, some people, is able to just walk out of the house and you have green all over, others are not, but there are ways which you can remediate that. You could, if you are in a big city, and I talk a lot to educators, I think that schooling and pedagogy is essential here. And I'm going to have a call for farming as well, as you'll see in a second, which is every school needs to take the kids out, even if it's to a little park, because if you go to a little park that has a little bit of gravel, trees, and sky and sun and clouds and birds and larvae and worms, you have geology, you have biology, you have chemistry, you have physics, you have astronomy. It's all there. So you can actually educate outside the classroom and use nature as your classroom and create this narrative. To me, I call this biocentrism, which is the essential principle of this book, which is that a planet that holds life is a sacred planet. And when I mean sacred, I don't mean, in a Christian, Jewish way. I mean sacred as a place that we venerate as the only thing that allows us to be here. As our mother, as many indigenous cultures have been telling us for thousands of years. But if we live in a city and we've never seen this, we don't understand it. We don't hear the story of who we are, of the planets, of the universe, of the evolution of life. How are we going to do this? So schools need to tell this story at all different levels, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, college, postgraduate, every level of education needs to make this story of who we are, of how we tell the story of the universe and our belonging and gratitude for being here. Part of every citizen of the world needs to know this, right?
Marcelo, after I saw David Grinspoon, we had a conversation, and I asked you, does the faculty at Dartmouth believe David when he's saying we're facing an extinction event? And you said yes, overwhelmingly. I said, so why hasn't the curriculum been transformed if you're facing extinction, which is a pretty terrifying thing? And if we have a war, everybody is transformed, and they're going around collecting steel to use for weapons. So I'm just curious, this is a development since then. Is this forming in your mind about what a curriculum might look like?
Yes.
That would address this need, this as part of this manifesto?
Absolutely. So I actually is part of the manifesto. I talk about you need to implement this in every curricula, right? I mean, it's just, as you know that 2 + 2 is 4, you should know what life is, where it comes from, how are we connected to it. It's not difficult science, it's stuff we can say with words, and it's absolutely essential to develop a sense of responsibility. To me, it's more than a curricular emergency. It's a moral imperative that we have right now. And I have done this. My classes at Dartmouth, I go straight on to this. I may be teaching the history of physics or whatever, of quantum physics. They will hear this story that I'm telling you right now, right? And they are profoundly moved because I tell them, look, you guys are the ones that are going to have to deal with this. So this is the story that should be empowering you to be the agents of change, right? I mean, it's essential. And furthermore, I tell the educators that they are also the agents of change. There is a tremendous amount of responsibility in education because we need to spread this story, right? Everyone should be telling this story. So the educators have to be inspired by this narrative, yes, so that they tell the story to the kids, and then the kids so you empower the educators. Yes. I say you guys can change the world because you are talking to the generations that need to hear this story. And then the kids hear the story and they say, wow, this is the world I live in. I need to do something about this. And so absolutely, that's
So this is really redefining citizenship.
Yes.
In other words, our schools are to create valuable citizens and people who can have fulfilling lives. But this is reimagining that. There's been a long period, I think, where citizenship in de facto in the country was almost defined as being fit to work in a large industrial enterprise, right? I mean, school was actually literally, consciously, how do we train people to work in the factories?
Yeah, and look at the word, citizenship. It's the one that belongs to the city. That is just wrong. It should be natureship. We belong to nature. City is something we just built on top of it, right? And so the whole structure is wrong, right? Even the word religion, right? If you think of the word religion, the way I use it, if you go to the Latin root, one way of reading it, there are differences, but this one I like, is religare, which means to reconnect. Ligar is to ligate, to connect. So reconnect with what? With this, with where we came from. This is what, so this is my cry, so to speak. This is my motion, you know, in terms of what I think needs to be done. There is the less principle, the more principle, and then there is this connection with the history of who we are and how we connect to nature that should be part of a curricular revolution, really, you know. And, you know, I try to do it as much as I can, as a voice towards it. And I'm also reaching out now to the corporate world. So I'm also beginning to train or advise, you know, those who control corporations in different places to rethink their role as leaders. Because, you know, the idea that infinite progress and open-ended economic growth is just suicidal, and it's completely fundamentally wrong, and it's not going to keep happening. And so the whole mindset of circular economy, systemic thinking, where is your product coming from, where is it going to, what is the energy that you're using to create what you're doing coming from, how do you put the refuse back, all of these are circles, they're all together, you know, and they make part of this giant whole, which is really global nowadays. You can't break this apart, you know. So this global systemic thinking is really essential for informed leadership. And then finally, I make a call for the farmers as well, because you guys are out in nature doing things, and I think you do too little to invite people to see your work. You could connect to schools. You could help organize groups of kids to come and visit farms, educate them on how it's going, why organic is different, why it's fundamental, and why you're deeply connected to the nature cycles. As a person, as a human, a farm is a spectacular laboratory for natureship.
Yeah.
And it could be done much more than it is.
Yeah. You know, in Denmark, an enormous percentage of the citizens visit an organic farm every year. And they do it they have one day where all the organic dairy farmers have agreed to let the cows out of the barn when the grass is good enough. And I don't know if you've ever seen cows leaving the barn, but after being in all winter, they have such joy. Mm-hmm. They frolic, they leap, they're kicking their heels up. And people now, it's a big deal. They take picnic lunches, they take their kids out. And this is the day that all the farms have said, you know, all the organic farms have said, we're going to let the cows out of the barn. Of course, the confinement places never let them out of the barn. They're always bringing the food into the barn to feed the cow.
And it happens to us, right? Think about us, you know, after a long New England winter, when everything starts to go green and there's an explosion of life and diversity and color, and you're going like, right? So yeah, because we need this stuff, right? That's what we are. I mean, this is our partnership with the world. And so to me, this connection is not just intellectual, but it's deeply spiritual too, right?
Yeah. Okay, so good. So let me ask a challenging question, which is, of course, once we say we need to create a culture that will really encourage natureship, right? That is really going to be different. It's going to be transformative. And of course, there's going to be a tremendous amount of power resisting that change. Mm-hmm. And we see it all the time, everywhere. That there is always a status quo that is designed to resist the change because the people who are in charge of it are profiting from it, and that makes them feel good about themselves. So do you have thoughts about how we address that? It's interesting that you're planning to work with some corporate leaders, and I myself have asked the question about, is that possible? My favorite story of that is Emmanuel Faber, who's a Swiss guy who was made the head of Danone. And my God, he was inspiring. And I think he was for real. I don't think it was just greenwash talk. I don't. I think he was genuinely trying to change the purpose of business. He planned to make a profit doing it. So he didn't plan to, transform capitalism. He planned to create a more enlightened capitalism through the example of Danone. And of course, they had a down year, and he was gone. And which raised for me the serious question, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't try those things, but I'm just looking at it, I'm going, well, I'm not sure the system will allow itself to be changed in that way. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah,
Marcelo?
I mean, people always talk to me about this, but now what? And I think there are two ways to think about this. One is the optimistic way, and one is the pessimistic way, right? And the pessimist, to me, is that guy that goes into the field to play a game and doesn't even kick the ball because he already lost the game. So like, what am I going to do, right? I mean, it's these corporations, they're not responding, so I'm not. And the optimist is the guy that says, look, there is work to be done, and there is opening happening. After all, this young man there was the leader of Danone, and he did something. So 10 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. So and there is the whole B corporation movement happening, which is huge. And so my sense of this is that the tides are turning. If you look at The Economist this week, the headline was, solar energy will change the world. So a lot of people are divesting from fossil fuels. And this is a movement that is beginning to happen. Everybody wants a profit. Organic farmers also want a profit. The point is that you can do that and still have a profit. And that's what we're going to say. In fact, the corporations that adopt a more open social network dynamics and a more horizontal power structure have people much happier at work there and produce better. So it helps to open up and to destroy those old structures of power, and I hope I'll live to see, but it may not be fast enough, that's possible, but it's happening. There's no question about it, it's happening. And it's a good feeling to see this, right? I mean,
yeah. I sometimes talk with people about optimism, and I know that you've thought about it a lot, and we've already talked about it a little, but I'm actually not an optimistic person, but I insist that I also not be defeated, and that I keep trying. So I'm just curious, because I think that the optimism you're talking about isn't just spontaneous. It's more of a strategic decision. It's more of something that's practiced and maybe that can be taught. I'm curious your thoughts about that.
Yeah, and that's related to this whole biocentric pedagogy, so it is taught, and it could be something that hopefully more and more schools are going to embrace. I just literally last night, I gave a talk to 160 educators and secretaries of education in the whole of Brazil. And my whole talk was very much like this conversation we're having right now. Like, this is the situation, this is how we got here, this is why we can't go on this way, and this is why, as educators, as owners of any kind of business, including the farming business, you can self-organize to be more in contact with schools. And do it on a voluntary basis, meaning I own a farm, I'm going to go to my local school, talk to the principal, say, look, I would love to organize some tours with the kids in which we talk about, not just about the farming itself, but why this kind of farming is important for the world and how everyone can help. And these things, if you hit 1 in 20 or 2 in 20, then that one is going to talk to the parents, maybe the parents can come too. And the point is that I believe in the snowball effect of changing mindsets. And I could not wake up every morning if I didn't believe in what I'm doing. And so it's a matter of my own mental health and emotional health depends on the drive to kind of try to spread this idea, And yes, it's difficult, it's challenging. it needs to be refined in many ways, but this is exactly what I'm trying to do with the more corporate and other ways in which I am trying to implement these notions, these values.
Yes. Yeah. Good. That's one that I kind of struggle with. So, and I'm going to keep looking at it because I do have almost a loss of hope around a corporate solution, but certainly the people involved in this system are not. Nobody's beyond hope. It's not the people. The question is, do the people have the ability to change the system from within? I don't know that yet.
Yeah, and that's because of Milton Friedman and stockholding, right? It's not the leadership. It's not necessarily just the corporate leadership. It's because, as happened to Mr. Faber, is that if you do it differently and it doesn't work, you get fired by the board,
right,
which is responding to the interests of the stockholders.
Right.
But if the stockholders, the people that invest, the people that have money, start to think differently about what am I doing with my money? Is it worth destroying the world just to get a few more bucks in the bank? Or is there other ways that I can contribute to saving the world and get my bucks in the bank?
Right.
Then maybe that mentality changes, and so you need to kind of like inform people that there are ways of behaving in this planet which are not just destructive and parasitic, that can actually lead to the global good.
Yeah.
Right. And honestly, the global south in many ways is ahead of us,
Yeah.
in thinking that way.
Yeah, I know. I love that of course, you're from Brazil and you have a huge audience there that you're talking to and are part of that community and that dialogue. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty refreshing. Before we go, I did want to touch on reductionism, and just to help, because we talk about it a lot, but the model of reductionist science, and then as an alternative, looking at other kinds of science or ways of knowing. And I've heard you talk about Asian and traditional, like early Chinese, and I've heard you talk about indigenous as different ways of approaching knowledge and a different understanding. Could you touch on those things?
So there are two ways to talk about this. One is just within science itself, science meaning Western science, right? So let's go there first. So Western science, a lot of it has been based on what you said, reductionism, which is essentially, nature is very complicated. So if you can break a system into little bits and study the behavior of those little bits and then put them together to understand the bigger system, awesome. And it works in many, many ways beautifully. I mean, it has fueled the whole technological progress that we have. The only reason why we have a computer, right, it's a combination of classical mechanics, electromagnetism, quantum physics is all in there. It's because of this reductionistic approach. So that's just great, right? But for certain kinds of systems, this way of thinking just does not work, right? And there is this other way, which is complexity science. Which
called what?
Complexity
science.
Yeah. And it's about emergence, the concept of emergence, which is really beautiful, which is the notion that when you have a system that has many parts, they interact with one another. Depending on how they do that, they may create behaviors which cannot be reduced to the single parts. So one very simple example of that is temperature. The concept of temperature is everywhere, right? But temperature really is the product of the behavior of many different molecules of gas. They are kind of colliding with one another. So if you have just 2 or 3 of those molecules, you cannot talk about them being cold or hot. But when you have a bunch of them, their collective behavior allows us to describe that qualitatively through the measure of temperature, which really encompasses all of these things happening together. And there are many, many, many more interesting, like hurricanes and all sorts of other ones. But that's within science. And emergent science is really the science of the future, or actually the present, because when you talk about the climate, for example, you can't talk about the climate through reductionistic physics. It just does not work because it's so highly nonlinear and there are so many parts that interact with one another that you have to use different techniques to describe it. And the narrative of the way you predict things is different as well, right? So that's within science. So emergent science, systemic thinking, network science, these are all new things that we're doing now to try to describe more complicated systems like the brain or nature or the interactions between the brain and nature, etc. But then the other part of your question, which is more of a general cultural question, which is that many of the topics that we are debating today, right, or the questions that existential questions that we have are not new. They're very old. They're much older than science. And people have been dealing with those things for a long, long time. And so the relationship between forest and people and how you live in those places and how you can use the plants to kind of, as medicine, to kind of treat all sorts of ailments and to open your gateway to the spirit world, it's something that has been around for thousands and thousands of years. And there is beautiful, profound knowledge there that we're only beginning to kind of like pay the due respect, And so I think that one of the movements that I really embrace right now is not to dethrone Western science, but is to create a convergence of ways of thinking, addressing the same question. So for example, if you talk about the nature of intelligence, right? What is intelligence? Well, what kind of intelligence? Because you have all these different kinds of intelligences. Plant intelligence. Plants have developed strategies for survival for millions and millions of years. They have a lot to teach us because they work together, right? And collective intelligence of insects. Bees are spectacular, right? They have the idea of the beehive, right? I mean, this kind of like we work together for the good of the whole hive. And there is this thing called collective intelligence. And so let's think of the human hive a little bit and how we are all working together or could work together to create the common good at a global scale, right? And so bringing those spiritual ways of connecting to the natural world as an inspiration to promote change of mindset. Like, I mean, you look, people that don't get out of a city, you take them out of the city, let's go for a walk in a forest and let's watch a sunset from the top of a mountain. And let's rethink a little bit about who you are in the world and what is it that you're doing with your life. Those things, they do change people. I know because I've seen it. And we need to do more of that. So I think that's why I think this confluence of different ways of knowing is so important. We need to kind of open our old mindset of reductionism, mechanistic way of thinking, endless growth. I mean, the flag of Brazil has, in the middle of the flag has a little saying. It says, order and progress. That is precisely the positivistic, mechanistic way that was dominant at the late 19th century. And order from what? The laws of nature, the laws of man. Progress of what? By exploiting natural resources without thinking about the impact of all of that. So this mindset has to change. The Brazilian flag needs to change its saying, and it should be belonging and gratitude instead of order and progress.
Beautiful. All right. We should probably wrap up. We could talk for a couple of days, but let's finish. Is there any last thing you'd like to say, Marcelo?
I just, of all the things that I've said, I think I've said enough. That I really do hope that everyone, farmers included, will become more proactive about attracting people to their worlds, so that they can share the importance of what they're doing. So go out, reach out to the schools, the communities, so that more people can see your work, so that we can together construct this new pedagogy of natureship.
Marcelo Gleiser, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.